Have we entered the age of global boiling? This month is set to be the hottest ever on record, with heat waves and wildfires racing across the northern hemisphere. Scientists agree it is linked to our use of fossil fuels and carbon emissions. The UN is again calling for radical action, but is it too late? I'm Andrea Sankey, and today's newsmaker is global boiling. U.S. President Joe Biden has described the current temperatures as an existential threat, with a significant part of the world now engulfed in severe heat waves. UN Chief Antonio Guterres says we shouldn't be surprised. Scientists had been predicting this and warned us repeatedly about what was to come. Across North Africa, Southern Europe, China, and the U.S., people are dying from extreme weather. With hundreds of cities on red alert, governments are asking how they'll manage going forward. Let's take a look.
For vast parts of North America, Asia, Africa, and Europe, it's a cruel summer. For the entire planet, it is a disaster.
Μπροστά σε μια καταστροφή που όλος ο αγώνας μας και όλη μας η δουλειά μπορεί να πάει χαμένη σε ένα λεπτό, σε μισή ώρα. Είναι τραγικό.
This destroy all the islands, burn all the island. It doesn't stop. This is the bad thing. It doesn't stop. There is no end in this tragedy. There's no end.
Molte vie sono bloccate, molti alberi secolari e chissà quanti altri danni. Un vero peccato. Stiamo vivendo un momento difficile.
Climate change is here, it is terrifying, and it is just the beginning.
It's pretty clear, it's unequivocal that human-induced climate change is influencing heat wave events in terms of intensity and the frequency of occurrence.
Something like 40% of the planet is seeing a marine heat wave right now. That's very serious for the animals that live in the ocean.
Donc un jeune qui sort du nid et qui n'a pas des plumes pour le protéger ou comme ça, et qui séjourne sur un bord trottoir ou des choses comme ça, automatiquement on risque d'avoir des phénomènes de brûlure en plus.
Now, if you follow climate change, you'll remember that just over a year ago, both the North and South Pole experienced record-breaking heat waves. Yet here we are, just over a year later, and we're talking about more records being broken. So joining me now to discuss all the angles to this unprecedented heat are from Perth, Australia, Peter Newman. He's the coordinating lead author for the UN's IPCC on transport. He's also a professor of sustainability at Curtin University. Jennifer Newall joins us from Glasgow. She's a climate scientist and outreach lead at the Climate Majority Project. And Fahad Saeed is a scientific model and data manager, as well as a regional climate scientist at Climate Analytics. He joins us from Islamabad, Pakistan. Thanks all so much for being with us. Peter, you spoke with me just over a year ago when we saw those records broken at both the North and South Pole. We know we've been warned. scientists had said that most recently this was actually worse than they had predicted. Are you on that same page? Is this really worse, or do you think we had been warned and this is what you were expecting?
Well, like most human beings, you hope that some of the data is not quite as bad as you have seen it, and it is. The reality is the existential experience of massive heat, of intensive heat waves, really does affect you. And seeing all of those images that you've shown us there, it's very disturbing to see. And so the gut-wrenching side of this data has hit home for me, as it did in our Australian bushfires 4 years ago, which the rest of the world looked on and in horror. It was an existential experience for us in Australia, but now Europe is getting it. So it's terrible.
Well, it's winter in Australia, so I mean, what are we in for? I mean, in the rest, it's only July. I mean, we haven't even begun what is usually the hottest month of summer. And then Australia has another summer coming in just a few months' time. What are we in for?
Yes, well, they are seeing a substantial problem in Australia looming with the El Nino coming, and we've had a lot of rainfall, so there's been a lot of growth, and we fear that the bushfires are going to get out of control very quickly. So one disaster after the other, it builds on itself, and we just have to get to terms with the fact that climate change is happening faster and faster. And, well, we did predict that, but it's now real.
Yeah. Jennifer, we have to come to terms with it, but what do we do?
Good question. And I just want to add to what Peter said there, that what we're talking about are extreme weather events, and that these are just going to continue to be the norm. I think one of the first things that we need to do is accept and acknowledge the reality that we now face, that we have not done enough to avert the worst of the climate catastrophes. And unless we choose collectively to take real action, then this is going to become the norm. In fact, if we don't take real radical action collectively now, then we could be looking back 10 years from now and being like, oh, do you remember back in 2023, like that was actually such a warm year. That's the reality that we genuinely face if we don't choose to take collective action immediately.
But let me turn to Islamabad, Fahad. We talk about, taking this collective action. The UN says it has to be radical because we're at the point of no return, almost. But then we look at the only kind of immediate answer right now for these heat waves we're facing is the massive use, for example, of air conditioning for those who can afford it. That alone can undo, correct me if I'm wrong, any progress we may have made to try and cut our carbon emissions. And then we also have, a country like China has had a massive spike in electricity that they need to combat the heat via air conditioning and cooling systems. They're still using coal. They, meanwhile, argue, hey, per capita, we still pollute less than the United States. First of all, where does this leave developing countries, and how can we find this cooperative solution if that's where countries stand?
Yeah, actually, that's a very good and very difficult question to answer. And that is what we have been witnessing in the UNFCCC for like 3 decades now. That there has been a fight between developed countries and the big economies like China to cut the emissions. But who are at the forefront of these climate impacts? These are the developing country, the least developing country. Normally, the events that make to the news is that a heat wave or a climate catastrophe has struck a particular developing country, and there have been deaths, there have been economic damages. But now what we are witnessing is that the developed country or the big economies like US, like Southern Europe, like China, they are struggling. Even they are struggling to cope with that. And yeah, now what the world needs is to cut the emissions. There is Paris Agreement. The target of Paris Agreement is 1.5 degrees centigrade, and currently we are 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial world. And the IPCC, the science has told us that if we want to abide by this 1.5 degree centigrade limit of Paris Agreement, we have to cut our emissions by 50% by the end of this decade, by 2030, almost 50%. So, but this is a huge ask, and I cannot answer your question because it's $1 million question that the world should come together. Somebody like me sitting in a developing country with its economy struggling, I can only hope that come together, do collective action. We need a transformation of our energy system, and especially when it comes to the use of air conditioner. I'm among the haves. I can afford this air conditioning right now, but I feel for the street vendor outside home. He cannot afford. Last year we had a record-breaking heat wave and then the record-breaking flooding in Pakistan. Both these events, these extreme events, they tarnish the economy of the country altogether. And those who were the front lines were the poorest of the poorest who suffer. So I mean, it's a big question mark. It's a big question for the developed economies, for the developed countries to take the action to bring the world together at one page.
Right. Jennifer, go ahead. You had a comment.
Yeah, no, I think absolutely what Fahad said about what we need to do to limit to 1.5. But I think also beyond that, being truthful and honest with ourselves that we've already missed the opportunity to keep within 1.5, and what we really need to do right now is focus on that resilience. Like, how do we adapt to these extreme weather events becoming the norm? How do we work together and support? As Fahad quite rightly said, there is a massive injustice in not only the contributors towards this, towards the global warming, but also who suffers the most as a result. And I think it's actually a little bit heartbreaking that it's only really now when it's the US, it's the UK, it's Europe, it's Australia that are realizing and that are feeling the impacts, like the global south, those that are least responsible for this climate emergency, this existential threat to society and humanity as a species. Those that are least responsible have been suffering without support from those countries wealthy enough to be able to provide that for years now, and it didn't make the headlines until it happened, in the developed world.
But yeah, I mean, we are where we are. Peter, let me ask you, if we obviously won't make this 1.5, we may not even make 2, some scientists are saying. So we have to deal with what we're dealing with now. Is there an environmentally friendly, and you being a professor of sustainability, is there a sustainable way to adapt to what we're now going to have to deal with?
The last 2 years has seen some of the most incredible accelerated growth in the solutions to this crisis. I don't disagree with Jennifer that we should say, oh, it's all gone now, we just need to do the adaptation. We are getting on top of this problem. The amount of solar in the world doubled in the last 2 years. The amount of batteries increased 5 times. The amount of heat pumps 10 times in 2 years. It is accelerating beyond the predictions of the IPCC and beyond the IEA even. So the markets are now driving this, and it is certainly something that governments can help with, but governments are not as effective at getting very quick solutions as the market is. And the market is certainly got some bad eggs in it with the oil companies, gas companies and so on, still wanting to expand their operations. That has to stop. And this existential crisis is actually helping, because ordinary people are now going to look at those oil companies and say, unless you stop this, we are blaming you because we know who's doing this. This is why it's changing. And but I certainly don't give up. We're on the edge of extraordinary growth in the solutions right now.
Okay, it's glad to hear you say that. Okay, Jennifer, go ahead. Quickly respond.
Yeah, no, just to highlight that I wasn't saying let's just give up. It's just we need to be very realistic with where we're at. And also realistic, you are right that there has been so much development and investment. But we also have to face the truth that we can't just turn our existing systems green. There is a systemic issue here. And our current, like, this is driven by our current systems in capitalism that rely on consumerism with roots in a violent patriarchal and colonial history. And that is simply incompatible with a livable future. And I think we do need to acknowledge that and factor that into all that we do going forward. And there absolutely are, routes and pathways for a successful, livable future, and also a just future as well. So it's absolutely not kind of saying that all hope is gone. Not at all.
Let me turn back to Fahad, though, because, okay, we can talk about adapting technologies. If Peter is right, those technologies are making a lot of progress. We may see them properly and widespread soon. But right now, we're dealing with other issues that developing countries like Pakistan may not see. There's the issue of climate migration. And I have to ask if there has been any substantial preparation for what may be to come there. I mean, Pakistan could be one of the worst hit countries, and we're seeing even the United States barely able to afford the cost of relocations in states like Louisiana. What's to come in Florida? What are developing countries supposed to do in the immediate term when it comes to the climate migration we're inevitably going to see?
We know that that the people die because of heat waves in developing countries, and they are not even being counted towards the calamity, and that's what we face during the IPCC. When we go in the IPCC, and I think Peter would agree to me that for example, over Africa, we don't have enough evidence because there are not enough studies which are there in the public literature. So it's the same thing in Pakistan. That for me, migration is a big issue, not only across the border but within the country as well. So you meant across the border, of course, there are certain triggers like economic conditions, and the problem is that people don't realize that it is the climate change. So I was talking with the farmers, and they did not realize that it was the heat wave last year in 2022, because of which the yield of wheat was compromised. So they had less yield. And then they were thinking of, changing their livelihood. They were thinking of moving toward the cities. And Pakistan is the fastest urbanizing country in South Asia. So people are moving from rural areas to urban areas, just stressing the urban areas, the civic facilities, and all that. So that's what we call a cascading effect. So one extreme climate event leading to multiple events down the road. So, and I would totally agree with you. It's a big problem, big issue developing countries are struggling with.
And Peter, another fascinating phenomenon I'm still learning, even though I look at this on a daily basis. I didn't realize, in Florida, for example, with sea temperatures hitting hot tub levels, there's now marine heat waves. That's a phenomenon, I'll admit my ignorance. I hadn't heard of that before. Now killing fish and sea life. What are the consequences of that? We're only talking about, the consequences we're suffering on land with, these temperatures, land temperatures, but there's these sea temperatures as well that will also affect us on dry land.
Well, everything that gets hot in the ocean ends up developing into a major storm, a hurricane, a typhoon, a cyclone, whatever you want to call them. That hot air rises from that ocean, and that the Gulf of Mexico, for example, when Katrina hit New Orleans, that increased in temperature 5 degrees very quickly. And that was like a sudden flood of heat had gone in there. It all ended up in a massive storm that hit New Orleans. So these things are happening. There are atmospheric rivers that are now forming and going over whole continents that are flowing through. We had these northern Italy ice dropping out of the sky the size of a brick. These are the intense and extreme things that are now happening, and we can expect more of them. But let me just say, I don't think it is entirely depressing to say that the third world and the problems of patriarchy and colonialism have to get solved before we deal with this issue. Already there are massive changes happening. I was in China last week. Virtually every every form of transport is going electric. The buses, the two-wheelers, the three-wheelers, they've now built the equivalent of 100 coal-fired power stations in renewable energy. They are way ahead of their targets. So the opportunities are being demonstrated. And the article that I was getting some of that data from showed how Vietnam, Thailand, India, many developing countries are rapidly adopting solar as well, because it is cheaper and it does fit with the culture in terms of distributed usage in small villages, in large parts of cities where they have community-oriented governance. It is possible to make these changes quickly. And I think if we have the climate grief only, rather than seeing the hope that is there, we are going to create more and more of the problems rather than the solutions. We have to have hope.
So optimism is necessary here. But Jennifer, I mean, we've also heard so many complaints that the structures, the legal structures, are not in place to properly penalize those committing, people like to call it ecocide, and that what laws are there are only working on the margins, if they're working at all. Do you still think there's a solution in changing laws, or do we need to let that go and make more financial incentives for greener energy to develop the technologies necessary?
That's a really good question, and I think there still is scope for changing laws, especially if governments are holding to account those responsible. So if laws are being broken, that they are held to account. Where damage is done, the account and the cost of that damage is put upon those responsible for it. So in that regard, absolutely, yes, these laws are needed. I've worked with the Ecocide campaign in part of my work, and they can see that, you know, just by having businesses and the market know that they could be heavily penalised for damage to the environment and people's livelihoods through irresponsibility, then that's really changing their behaviors already. So there is scope for laws. I want to respond to something that Peter said, though. Again, like, and I fully agree, and I want to reiterate that there absolutely is hope, but it can't be blind hope. It needs to be active hope, and yes, absolutely, we have these technologies. Sorry, but it needs to be at local level.
We have
and
1 minute
communities.
left, and I just want to give Fahad a minute for your final thoughts.
Yes, of course, that the injustice, I would like to highlight some of the injustice we are witnessing in this world, and especially when it comes to climate change and the emissions. But at the same time, there is certainly the hope. IPCC tells us that if we don't act quickly, we will reach 1.5 somewhere in the next decade. But at the moment, we are 1.2 degrees centigrade warmer than the pre-industrial world. We have to tell ourselves that the extremes we are witnessing today, they are only going to get more intense with every 10th of a degree of warming. I would just like to point out that a study was done, what is called climate extreme event attribution study, and that by using state-of-the-art data and methods. And the finding of the study were that in the world without climate change, in the pre-industrial world, these extremes, heat extreme we have seen in China, Southern Europe, and US and Mexico, would be virtually impossible, So that is the footprint of climate change that we are witnessing at the moment.
Fahad, that will have to be the final word. I'd like to thank all three of my panelists so much for being with us. Unfortunately, we're out of time for this edition of The Newsmakers. Thanks to our viewers, of course, for joining us as well. Remember, you can follow us on Twitter, and do be sure to subscribe to our YouTube channel. I'm Andrea Sankey. We'll see you next time.